Imagine showing up every single day and genuinely not knowing whether you're doing a good job. Not because you aren't trying, but because no one has ever told you what good actually looks like. Look, we've all been there, and this lack of direction can rob even the hardest worker of their motivation and purpose. So today, let's get to the bottom. Well, welcome back to the Frontline Leadership Podcast, where we help frontline leaders become the professional leaders that transform business bottom lines in the process. I'm your host, Craig Coyle, former Apache helicopter pilot, aerospace leader, and founder of Operation Lead. And look, if you're a senior leader who continues to invest in developing your frontline supervisors, but you aren't seeing it translate, I want you to know that you are not alone. But more importantly, that there's a reason. So let's dive in. Over the last few episodes, we've been building something. We talked about emotional intelligence, the framework for understanding yourself and others at a deeper level. We went deeper on self-leadership, the daily orientation that determines who we are as leaders and how our leadership manifests, whether anyone is watching or not. And then last week, we talked about how personality and communication styles shape who we are and how we operate, and why it's so important to understand how this manifests in ourselves and in those we lead. All of that is foundational. It matters a lot. But there's a gap that most organizations never close. A supervisor can have genuine self-awareness. They can have real emotional intelligence. They can even understand exactly how their people are wired, and they can still fail at the most fundamental operational responsibility they carry every single day, giving their people clarity. Now, most people treat expectation setting like an art, like something certain supervisors just have, right? A natural ability to communicate direction, hold standards, keep a team aligned without confusion. And we celebrate those supervisors. We call it leadership ability. We call it presence. We call it talent. But today I want to offer a different framing entirely. What we're actually watching when we see that supervisor is science, a repeatable structure, a learnable skill, something that can be taught, replicated, and embedded into the way an entire organization operates that its leaders simply need to fall into. That's what we're building today. So let's start where most conversations about this topic don't, with an honest look at why supervisors struggle to set clear expectations in the first place. Because the default answer most organizations land on is a personality diagnosis. Things like, well, they're just not a communicator, or they need to be more direct. Maybe that's just not their strength. But if you were with us last week, you know that personality doesn't make the leader. It just shapes how the leader shows up. And when that's the diagnosis, the solution becomes things like communication training, maybe a workshop, maybe a course. We leverage a certain style or tactic to address the symptom that we see. But it's a Band-Aid solution. And then 6 months later, the same problem on the same floor with the same supervisor. But here's what's actually going on. First, they were never taught what real clarity looks like. Think about it. Most frontline supervisors were promoted because they were exceptional at the work. They knew the process. They hit the numbers. They were the person everybody went to when something went sideways. And we talk about this all the time. And then the organization said, you are our best person. You're the one to lead the team. But no one showed them what it actually looks like to hand that work to someone else with precision. No model, no demonstrated standard, no framework for what clear expectations even require. They're just doing their best, but they're improvising. And improvisation produces inconsistency. Second, they're assuming that understanding is confirmed when it's not. I'm sure they said the thing, and then they moved on. In their mind, the expectation was set, but declaring clarity and verifying it are two completely different acts. Said another way, just because you say something doesn't mean it gets heard. And most supervisors haven't been taught the difference. So they communicate, they assume it lands, and they're genuinely surprised when it didn't. And then you can cue the slippery slope of misaligned expectations. This isn't arrogance, it's a gap in development. And then third, and this one sits above the supervisor entirely, is that there's no organizational standard. A supervisor cannot execute a standard that doesn't exist above them, that isn't modeled for them. The only clarity that exists in most organizations is the job description and maybe the annual review. But both completely miss the need for genuine clarity in the day-to-day. If the organization has never defined what clear expectations actually look like, no shared language, no common framework, no accountability infrastructure, then the supervisor is trying to build something without a blueprint, without an example. And when the blueprint or example doesn't exist at the senior level, you can't be surprised when it doesn't show up on the floor. So what does this gap actually produce? Because it doesn't stay invisible. It shows up every day in ways that get labeled as something else entirely. Things like rework that didn't need to happen. Probably because two people were operating on two different definitions of what done looks like. Or conflict that started as confusion. Someone that thought they were doing the right thing, a supervisor thought they weren't. And what could have been a clarifying conversation hardens into resentment instead. Or maybe it looks like disengagement from team members who stopped trying to hit a standard nobody could actually describe. Why keep pushing when you genuinely don't know what the target looks like? Or maybe it's turnover from people who never felt like they were set up to succeed, who spent months in a fog of ambiguity and eventually decided that their energy was better spent elsewhere. Look, every one of these outcomes gets labeled as something else. It's a performance problem. It's a culture problem. It's an attitude problem. The expectations gap is the root, and it almost never gets named. In aviation, mission failure is never caused by a crew that didn't try. It's almost always caused by communication gaps. Someone operating on a different set of assumptions than the rest of the crew. Maybe it's one person thinking the route goes this way and another this way. And by the time the discrepancy surfaces, you're already in the precarious moment. Clarity in the cockpit isn't a leadership preference. It's an operating standard that everything else depends on. And I think the same is true on your floor. So if this is an infrastructure problem, well, what does the infrastructure actually look like? Here's where most leadership content stops short. Because there are two distinct types of clarity that needs to be fueling every team every single day. And most supervisors and leaders in general are only thinking about one of them. Not all expectations are the same. I'm going to say that again. Not all expectations are the same. And until a leader understands that distinction, they're going to keep applying the same tool to two very different problems and wondering why one of them never quite gets solved. Here's the distinction. There's the clarity that governs individual performance. What this person is responsible for, to what standard, by when, what happens when they hit it, and what happens when they don't. This is the clarity that lives between a supervisor and a team member. It's personal, it's specific, it's direct. And then there's the clarity that governs collective direction, where this team is going, why it matters, what winning looks like for everyone together, how we fit into the bigger picture. This is the clarity that answers the question every team member is quietly asking, whether they say it out loud or not. Why does any of this matter? Both are the supervisor's responsibility, and they require completely different conversations. Individual clarity, this is what I call the crew responsibility lens. In aviation, crew responsibilities are never assumed. We talked about this briefly already. Before any mission begins, every crew member knows their role, and not in a general sense, but very specifically, what they're responsible for and when at every moment of the mission, what standard they're expected to meet, what the plan is if something goes wrong, and who does what. That brief happens before every single flight, not just once during onboarding, never again. That's not bureaucracy. That's how high-performing crews operate without confusion. For a frontline supervisor, individual clarity lives in the one-on-one, the specific conversation with a team member that answers what is expected of you, what good looks like, and what the stakes are. And then it gets reinforced in the daily stand-up or crew brief. Not a full reset conversation every morning, but a consistent touch point that keeps expectations visible and alive. Individual clarity isn't a one-time event. It's a consistent discipline. A supervisor who sets expectations in January and hasn't revisited them since hasn't maintained individual clarity. They've only declared it. And declaring clarity fades. The crew brief and the one-on-one exists precisely to keep it alive. And then there's collective clarity, the mission lens. Individual clarity tells someone what to do, but collective clarity tells them why it matters. And that distinction, it's the difference between compliance and commitment. A team with individual clarity but no collective direction is a group of people executing tasks. They know what's expected, they may even hit the standard, but they're doing it because they have to, not because they believe in it. But a team with both individual clarity and a shared sense of mission, that's a crew, aligned, moving in the same direction, motivated not just by the standard, but what the standard is in service of. The mission conversation is one of the most underrated and underused tools in leadership. And because the mechanics of how to do both of these deserve more than just a short conversation, we're going to go deep on each of them in future episodes. The specific structure, the right cadence, how to make both individual and collective clarity a consistent discipline rather than just a good intention. But I want you to remember this. There are two types of clarity, both important and both dependent on each other. Clarity without purpose produces compliance, and purpose without clarity produces enthusiasm that goes nowhere. You need both. Now, I want to address something directly because whenever this kind of structured approach to leadership comes up, there's a pushback I hear pretty consistently. Things like, this sounds transactional, or this sounds a lot like management, but not leadership. And honestly, it's a fair read on the surface. A structured approach to individual expectations, a deliberate conversation about collective mission, systems, and frameworks applied to something as human as leadership. It doesn't immediately sound like the warm, relational experience we all aspire to create for our teams. So let me be honest about something first. Used in isolation, this is incomplete. A supervisor who sets structured expectations but invests nothing in the relationship, who treats their team members as outputs to be managed rather than people to be developed, yes, that's going to feel transactional, hollow even. The framework isn't the problem there. The absence of everything else around it is. This is one component of a holistic leadership picture. And like any component, it only works the way it's designed to work when it's part of the whole system. But here's what clarity actually does for a team member when it exists inside a healthy leadership environment. It removes the low-grade stress of not knowing where they stand. It clears the cognitive and emotional space that was being spent on guessing, on second guessing, on bracing for the next correction they didn't see coming. In that cleared space, that's where real relationship can live. The supervisor who leads with clarity isn't being cold, they're being respectful. They're telling their team member, you matter enough for me to be precise with you. I'm not going to make you guess. I'm going to tell you exactly where you stand and what you need to do. That's not transactional. It's one of the most human things a leader can do. And the same is true for the mission conversation. A team that understands why their work matters, that has a shared sense of direction beyond just hitting the daily standard, they're not just more compliant, they're more committed. It's not soft or manipulative, it's the difference between a group of people executing tasks and a crew that believes in what they're building and where they're going. And last but not least, the art of leadership, the presence, the genuine investment in people, the ability to connect with a team member in a way that actually changes not just how they show up, but how they live. That shows up in the relational moments that the science of leadership makes room for. Without the science, the art doesn't have a stable floor to stand on. But with it, leadership becomes something so much more than management. Becomes the kind of experience that makes people want to stay, want to grow, want to bring their best. Not because they have to, but because they're part of something worth it. Last thing, and this one is for the senior leaders in the room. Everything we've talked about today applies up the org chart too. Your supervisors cannot give clarity to their teams if they haven't received clarity themselves. Whatever exists at your level, whether that's clarity or ambiguity, compounds as it moves down. And if you haven't defined what good looks like for your supervisors, well, then you can't be surprised if your supervisors haven't defined it for their teams. The gap doesn't start on the floor. It starts wherever the clarity stops. And here's the hard truth about development. A supervisor who understands everything we've covered today and then returns to an operation with no infrastructure to reinforce it, they're going to revert. Because the skills need systems to survive. Individual development is necessary, but it isn't sufficient. The science has to be embedded in your one-on-ones with your supervisors, in your shared language, in the accountability infrastructure, in how the organization functions. Not just taught in a room and hoped for on the floor. That's exactly why the frontline leadership system is built first and foremost as an operating infrastructure and then a development infrastructure, not a training or an event. Because clarity has to exist at every layer or it doesn't really exist at all. Look, if today's episode connected, here are 2 ways that you can take the next step. If you want to integrate this level of clarity into your daily leadership routine, well, I think the Leader's Pre-Flight Checklist is just for you. And it's available free at operationlead.com/checklist. It's the daily habit infrastructure that takes these concepts and more and then integrates them into your actual day-to-day leadership practice. Again, that's available at operationlead.com/checklist. And if you're a senior leader ready to explore what it actually looks like to build this kind of clarity infrastructure inside your operation, I invite you to learn about our system and process at operationlead.com. So here's what we covered today. Setting clear expectations isn't a personality trait, and it's not a natural gift. It's a science. And sciences can be taught, they can be replicated, and they can be embedded in a system. Your supervisors aren't failing at this because of who they are. They're failing because no one showed them what it looks like or gave them a simple process to follow to bring it to life each and every day. There are 2 types of clarity every team needs. And the best supervisors are probably only delivering one of them. Individual clarity tells your team members what's expected of them. But collective clarity tells them why it matters. And you need both. Together, they communicate more than just expectations. They drive results. And finally, clarity isn't transactional. It's respectful. It creates the conditions for real relationship, real trust, real engagement to exist. The art of leadership shows up in the space that the science of leadership makes room for. Next week, we're going to talk about the human side of everything we covered today. Because knowing the science of clarity is one thing, but for a new supervisor who just stepped out of the peer group they used to belong to, actually using it is an entirely different challenge. The transition from peer to leader is one of the hardest things a new supervisor faces. And how your organization handles it determines whether everything we talked about today ever makes it to the floor. That's episode 17. You won't want to miss it. Until then, I'm Craig Coyle, and this is the Frontline Leadership Podcast. Let's lead.